Welcome to Grinding the Data. My name is Kevin Scott. I'm excited to be back with you today for our ninth installment of the Expert Series. Today we have two experts for the price of one, both Jared Smola and Matt Schauf. Is it Schauf?
Oh yeah, you nailed it.
Schauf, I nailed it. From Draft Sharks. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us, Kevin. Good to be here. Yeah, we're a package deal.
Yeah, and I'm always happy to go on a show where somebody can get my last name correct. So
there you
off
go.
To a great start.
It's an honor to have you both on, chat through some fantasy questions and ideas with you. Also get to know you guys a bit. We haven't done this before, so thank you for taking the time, and I appreciate it. Our plan on this pod is just to walk through some questions. We've been doing this with all the experts. I think you guys in particular can answer some of these questions in helpful ways for our listeners. And we'll just see where that leads us. And then we're going to close with a fun ranking exercise as we've been doing with everyone. So let's start by just helping our listeners get to know you guys a bit. When did you start playing fantasy football, and how long have you been analysts who are studying the game and helping others win? Let's start with you, Jared.
I started playing in 1998, I believe it was. I was 10 years old. Nice. I remember I had a Marshall Falk on that team who had a massive, like, Christian McCaffrey-esque type of season, and I was kind of hooked from there. And then I started with Draft Sharks in 2007. It was actually my freshman year of college. Worked a couple of years part-time with Draft Sharks. Actually, the owner of the site, Lenny Papano, had a magazine back then. The fantasy magazines were big at that time. So I did some writing for that. Then kind of took a full-time job with the company right out of college.
That's awesome.
What's a magazine?
I mean, I used to buy several of those every year. Those were fun. It's just fun to have it in your hands, though, right? I mean, now you got the same thing with the Kindle. You don't ever hold the books. I kind of miss the magazines.
Hey, it's still going. You can still find them at the grocery stores.
Is it Draft Sharks?
Well, not the Draft Sharks one, but
there are still some. Yeah, I've seen them around. I just haven't bought them in a while.
It's funny. I've got Jared by 9 years overall, but I think I started playing fantasy football just after he did. So I guess I'd blame my dad for not getting me into it sooner. I don't remember exactly what year it was. Sometime in the 1999, 2000, 2001 range when I was in college. And actually, Marshall Falk was, oddly enough, my first ever pick. It was in a keeper league, so I kept him until I couldn't anymore. Drafted LaDainian Tomlinson as a rookie in that same league. So
wow.
Needless to say, that league's still going today. It doesn't have all the original members, but probably about half of them. And at this point, I still have the most league titles overall. So the guys started out not liking me very much. From the analyst standpoint, I started in late 2002, kind of by accident. I was working at a newspaper at that point, and the sports editor was like, let's do a fantasy column. You're the only one that plays. Do you want to write a fantasy column for me? I was like,
that's awesome.
Guess so. Sure, I'll do that. And then I did it. I enjoyed it. I was like, man, I would like to do some more of this. So I just went online. Ended up finding Mike Beacom, who had Pro Fantasy Sports at that point. He gave me a spot, had something available. That kind of pushed me into doing IDPs, which quickly turned into a niche for me. And then I just kind of found my way through a bunch of different things from there to now working with Jared and Lenny and Kevin at Draft Sharks for, I think, 11 years now.
Wow, that is awesome. Very cool. Now, the you said that first league that you started and you had Falk and LT. I guess that was a dynasty league all the way back in like 2000, or is it a keeper or something?
It was keeper, and I think the difference is we only kept three. I think it was 3 players year to year, and that has since dropped to 2. But
those were big back then, and now I was going to say that's a really early for a dynasty league, but that's cool that it's still going.
I always won. I pushed for keeping more players, but they're like, nah, we want to have more to pick from next year.
Yeah, and they don't want you to keep all your good players. That's right. So you guys work at Draft Sharks. Tell us a little more about Draft Sharks and what sort of makes your site or your company unique, or a good place for folks to find fantasy help.
I think the one thing, and it's becoming more rare nowadays, is we just do football. We're not messing around with NBA or baseball or anything.
Or golf.
It's all golf. Well, in my spare time, a little golf, but professionally, it's just football at Draft Sharks, which I think makes a big difference. We have projections up on our site already, and we've been spending the past couple of months digging deep into the rookie class. I think that's something that sets us apart.
Yeah.
I think there's also a differentiator in the site being around since '99 and all of us having played for a while. So, we're not just new guys with spreadsheets. We've been drafting for a while, know how to talk to various kinds of drafters who have been, spending various amounts of time and draft in different ways over the years. And then, the big thing is the site itself. Obviously, people are looking for a website that's going to help them win. We've got that focused on football staff. We've got multiple wins in rankings accuracy competitions through the years to kind of, show that we know what we're doing. And back before I was with it, the Draft Sharks was one of the pioneers of value-based drafting, had the MVP draft board, which kind of assesses the whole draft picture for you and recommends a pick for you. That's evolved into what our draft war room is now, that syncs with league sites and, just like helps you all the way through the draft. I think that's kind of the differentiator at this point, is we have the content that people are looking for, but we're also developing the tools that I think more and more people are looking to have help in drafting, like everybody's looking to have all their processes made easier, not just in fantasy, but in everything in life. So that's what Draft Sharks is doing now. We'll tell you why we're picking guys. We'll tell you why we don't like certain guys, but we're also going to give you the tools that will help make your draft experience easier.
That's awesome. Yeah, very good info. I'm definitely going to be checking it out. And I totally agree with you that it makes a big difference when a site or just analysts in general are focused on only football. I mean, I guess I say that sort of selfishly because I don't care about the other sports myself. Like, I'm looking at football year round, and I feel like it definitely helps me just to be, like, you guys are going to be aware of so much more that people have to try to catch up on if they've been involved in the other sports. So that's very cool. I know one of your big focuses, you guys have mentioned statistical projections. I know you both do that. And I guess our listeners, I've had several people comment to me like, hey, I need help. Like, how do I start this process? Or so you could talk about that, or just kind of, your whole projections process. How do you go about that? How do you start and go, whatever you want to share there.
Yeah, I think how Matt and I go about doing projections is pretty similar. We've sort of, I think, meshed some of our ideas even over the years as far as doing projections. But it's definitely a team by team thing. I should start by I like looking at league wide trends before I even get into the projections every season. Just how many offensive plays are teams running? Is that going up or down in general? What's the run pass split looking like league wide? And I think we all know teams are passing more than they did 10 years ago. Personnel groupings is something I look at. Our team's getting more wide receivers on the field. Our team shifting to more 2 tight end stuff. Target shares by position is always interesting to look at. Our team's targeting their running backs more or less than they have been. So I kind of start there just to set a baseline before I start digging into every team. But then it is a team by team process. You kind of start with the base layer being like, how many plays do we expect this team to run? How are those plays going to be divvied as far as runs and passes goes? And that sort of gives you the volume that you can start to divvy up between the quarterbacks, between the running backs, between the wide receivers. You can start using things like, carry shares and target shares to figure out how many targets, carries a guy's going to get. And then kind of the last step is the efficiency stuff, catch rates, yards per catch, yards per completion, yards per attempt, all that stuff, touchdown rates. And you sort of apply that to the volume stuff, and that that spits out your projections that kind of fuel the fantasy point projections.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I like the same process. I like the research portion of it, especially like beyond the team by team thing, like not beyond, but in addition to, I like going through the weekly of the season for the team. So you can see if a guy, had a bigger target share weeks 1 to 8 than he had weeks 9 through 17, and then try to determine whether that was a trend or whether it was just a fluke, see what happened to other players when a certain player was missing time, all that stuff. That's the stuff that I really enjoy doing through the projections process.
That's cool. Yeah. So do you look any at coaching staff tendencies, or, get a new coach in town, like what they've done in the past? I guess that would be in that first portion, Jared.
Yeah, big time. It can be tricky though, because some coaches are more rigid in, how they're going to call plays, what pace they're going to run at, how they're going to distribute targets. Whereas other coaches, and I'd say the better coaches, are going to adjust their play calling to the personnel. So I don't think you want to take what a coach did for one team and just say they're going to do the same exact thing for their new team. They might, but they probably shouldn't. So I do think you have to factor in the personnel when you're, trying to figure out what the coaching change is going to mean.
Right. Yeah, that's all helpful, and that's very similar to what I've done when I've done projections. And I've had Dwayne McFarland on. He's talked about the almost the same process, and so it's good to know. Like that's a really good way to go about it. I think the trickiest part for me is when you're doing that top line, team by team look at like how many plays are going to run, what the percentage is. It's so hard to hit that right. When I look back at the projections, it's like, oh yeah, they did shift gears, or maybe like you're saying, they have different personnel and they went a different route, or even a longstanding coach like Andy Reid. I'm a Chiefs fan. I mean, he'll just change. He'll run more, pass more than you think he's going to, and that's, I guess the league's always evolving, but that gives you the best chance of hitting it, right?
Yeah, and I mean, your projections they're never going to be accurate. It's just, can they be more accurate than what everyone else is doing?
Right.
That's
Exactly.
kind of what who's going to have the least crappy rankings is sort of what fantasy ends up being. Because everyone's going to be wrong about a ton of this stuff, but if you can just eliminate as much of that wrongness as possible, I guess.
And of course, the biggest challenge is the info that we're taking from the past is all from small samples. I mean, the entire season is only 17 games now. It was 16 games.
Yep.
And then we're projecting it for a full season of games that we know have high variance. So, I think of all of this as kind of the dose of reality rather than the rigid framework for what we have to build everything on.
Yeah, right. And that's a good point. That goes back to looking at like the league wide trends and baselines. Like that helps me kind of set expectations, especially things like touchdown rate. That can vary wildly from season to season, but in general, guys are going to regress towards whatever the league mean is. Quarterbacks are going to have about a 4.5% passing touchdown rate. Now, if you get someone like Aaron Rodgers, who's been in the league 15 years and he's averaging a touchdown, 6% of his throws. When we project him for this coming season, we should probably lean more towards that because he's done it for so long. But someone who's not been in the league as long, it's probably wise to project him something closer to league average when it comes to something like a touchdown rate.
Unless he loses Devontae Adams and breaks off engagement.
Yeah, it's probably a bad example.
Right. I was just thinking of Lamar Jackson last year. I think the year before he had 9% touchdown rate, and I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, I'm going to put him at 5% because that's just not going to happen again. And I don't know what his pace would have been. I think he was more like 4%, wasn't he?
I think so. I think it was sub 5.
Yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was definitely much down. So, yeah, I think that's a great thought. Going back to longer term trends is important too. A question for you is, so let's say you go through this process and you have, you go all the way back, do the league wide, look at each team, and you have this set of projections that you're happy with for 32 teams, and you're just looking at these. How do you take that, and you guys are draft sharks, right? So drafting is one of the most important parts of fantasy. How do you take your projections and turn them into rankings? Like, what is involved in that process, and does it always follow your projections? Do you have like a low range projection and a high range projection? How does that kind of work for you guys?
Well, first of all, Kevin, are you ever actually happy with the projections? I don't know. Jared, do you feel happy? Because I know we put some out there and we feel pretty good about them, but I know every time I look at it, I'm like, I don't know, should that guy be up here? Should that guy be down there? So,
I'm happy when I'm done.
That's also part of it.
Yeah. When I get all 32 done, I'm very ecstatic. And I'm like, yes, I did it. Yeah.
No, but I mean, it's definitely a year-long process, and we're always tinkering. I mean, the projections you see on the site right now, though, they're going to be quite a bit different by the time we get to August, and that's sort of part of it. But like when you do look at the, how the rankings came out, and someone might feel too high or feel too low, but I think that's where projections are important. Is it kind of gives you the basis for why that guy landed there. And if you think one of the inputs is wrong, like, okay, maybe I should give this guy a higher target share, then yeah, he deserves to move up the rankings. But if you think the inputs are right, then that's just where he belongs in the rankings.
So you do basically, you have your projection, and that equates to certain fantasy points, and then that spits out your rankings, and that's what you go by.
Yep, and we do have floor and ceiling projections for all these guys. So that's displayed. You can sort by those projections on the site, and we also have players tiered. And the tiers can be customized to your league scoring system on the Draft War Room. So I think that's big. I mean, if two guys are separated by 3 projected points, I have no issue taking the guy, with 3 fewer projected points. They're in the same tier. You can kind of go any direction with those guys.
But generally, you go by the median projections for the actual, rankings pull out. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
And even within that, though, so our particular process is we generally start with Jared doing the base projections, and then we get together and we're like, I don't agree with how high this guy is. I don't agree with where that guy came out. And then, there is some kind of fudging from that point because we're not sitting there like doing all of the math. But I think that's where reality meets rankings is the projections are the dose of reality. If you think you love a player and then
right.
if you are like mentally ranking him 16th heading into draft season and he comes out 25th at the position, you were probably wrong initially, or you don't know what the outlook is going to be for him. So there is some movement, I think, after we get that dose of reality, because we know that some of these things are going to be wrong. We don't know all the reasons, but there are some where we can say this might be the reason for this. So, you kind of manually adjust, but then you go with the projections to show that ranking. And then, as Jared said, we have the ceiling, we have the floor. And I think those are important for people to look at, because just drafting the next guy on the list is never going to be the best way to go through your draft. And we also have the upside mode that kicks in the draft war room. So that at a certain point you draft, the draft board automatically says, all right, you want to go for this guy because he has more upside than the other players around him, even though the basic projection doesn't show you that immediately. And that's the kind of thing you can either go by or you can ignore, but that's something that I think is important to look at, especially as you get further into a draft.
Yeah. And the margins on this stuff are so thin. Like you can add 1 percentage point in target share to a wide receiver and he's going to climb like 7 or 8 spots in the rankings. So that's where, again, I think that the tiers are important and not getting too stuck on, this guy's wide receiver 16, this guy's wide receiver 17. I got to take the guy ranked 16th.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of less arguing of player versus player right next to each other, which I'm sure Jared appreciates.
For sure.
And it's really cool that you guys will take these projections and then hash it out with other folks. I think that's where a lot of people struggle with projections, is they make it in a bubble or in a vacuum, and then they don't have other inputs, and they can miss obvious things. I also think one of the things you said that's important is a lot of people, when they're projecting, they kind of get the stars in their eyes thing about certain players, and they love him. And then they're just leaning fully on the upside or the high end of the projections. And then that, like you're saying, that can bump them up 10 spots. That's happened to me several times, as a younger player. And I would just load up on a guy because, he should be a 5th round pick and he's going in the 7th. And it's like, well, there's something you're missing, the low end side or the potential downside, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think now, the way to do that is, all right, I'll take this guy some in the 6th round instead of always taking him in the 5th round, because if the community says he's a 7th rounder, even if they're wrong, I don't want to bet so strongly against what, everyone else is saying.
Yeah. And give yourself some protection there. Yeah, that's good. I guess one other question related to projections I want to ask is, why do you think that it's a great part of the process, or such an important part? I think a lot of people who are listening, who maybe are even high stakes players, a lot of those listen to the show, and a lot of them rank by gut, and they just, I like this guy, I don't like that guy, or they just look at the ADP and they, I'm going to move this guy up or down. Why do you think projections are such an important part of the process to kind of take your game to the next level?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it might seem too simple, but to me, like this entire game we play of fantasy football is based on stats. So, like, I don't know. To me, just ranking on gut feel, not really working through, how a player is going to get to that spot in the rankings. I just feel like you're missing something. But even beyond that, and I think Matt kind of touched on this, but just the process of doing a deep dive on every team and every player, I think is just super valuable. Like, I'm not going to pretend that I'm not going to miss anything, but I think I'm going to miss a lot less than someone else who's just ranking, by doing the projections and really digging deep into all these teams and all these players.
That's a good point. You see every single potential contributor, right? Where a lot of times those guys might be missed.
Yeah, I mean, I think you sort of have to come up with these projections. And again, you're still going to miss stuff,
right?
But I think you just miss less.
Yeah, it's the dose of reality. It shows you, it can show you a reason why you shouldn't feel the way that you did about a player, or it can show you what he has to do to actually get to the level that you think he'll be. Whether it's claiming more target share from teammates, whether it's scoring touchdowns at an abnormal pace. Those are the kinds of things that can happen. Sometimes you just say, like, I really think that this guy is going to become their number one receiver this year. So I'm going to project it that way. It might end up being wrong. It might end up being right, but at the very least, it shows you what has to happen. If you make that guy 22% target share for his team, then somebody else has to come down. That was, maybe that somebody else is coming from 18 down to 14. And, you look at the effects of all that.
Right. Yeah, one of the things that just came to my mind when you said that percentage-wise is one of the things I've struggled with making projections is like the very small time contributors, knowing how to handle that. So maybe you've got, like, if you think of a team, maybe like the Chiefs last year, right? You have Tyreek Hill, you have Travis Kelce, you have Mecole Hardman, you have all these other guys, right? Byron Pringle, Demarcus Robinson, the backup tight ends. Do you guys worry like about getting every single potential person who's going to catch passes in your projections, or do you just kind of lump those last few guys together? How do you handle that?
And so I don't like make sure my projections completely align as far as like, okay, this quarterback's going to pass for this many yards, so all the receivers have to add up to that. But I usually leave some wiggle room. So like all the running backs, receivers, and tight ends I project will maybe account for like 95% of the team's targets.
Okay.
And then I do want to make sure that like if I add up all the pass catchers' catch rates, that they're pretty close to what I'm projecting the quarterback's completion rate to be. If I add up all the yards per target, that's going to be pretty close to what the quarterback's yards per attempt. So I do want that stuff to align in general. It doesn't need to be perfect because there's so much wiggle room with all this stuff. But that's again where I think doing it team by team and making sure all that stuff sort of meshes together is important if you want accurate projections.
Yeah, like no team is actually going to throw 100% of its pass attempts at a player. So the targets are not going to match up with the pass attempts. So, I think collecting all of those team numbers at the end and, seeing, okay, over the past few years, they've been averaging, 97% of their pass attempts actually become targets. So I have, 96 or 97% targets allocated. It doesn't have to be to players. A lot of times I'll project the 4 receivers that I think will actually be, somewhat relevant. And then I'll just leave another, 18 to 20 targets in the receiver space without assigning them to a specific player.
That's essentially what I've done too. Except I usually throw those last few targets in equally among the 4 guys who are relevant, and then just say, that whoever else catches them, who cares? It'll be close enough,
What we usually do is we get to draft season and somebody's like, "Why don't you guys have this guy ranked?" You're like, "Fine, we'll give him the 6 targets. We're sitting at the
throw him 30 targets."
Yeah.
That's funny. Well, that's all very helpful. I hope people, if they're considering doing that, that'll be a helpful boost to get them going for sure. I guess as you've been doing some projecting and ranking early, I know you guys have been doing that for longer than most folks at this point, since you're doing this year round. Who are a few players for each of you that you found yourselves higher or lower than consensus on?
You want to lead us off, Matt?
Sure. Jared and I actually just talked about this on the podcast last week, so I would imagine we have some overlap. But I want to start with Saquon Barkley, and it's not somebody that is there's not a huge difference in ranking, but he's going in that range where just a slight difference matters. And it's really been the difference between me drafting him a lot and other people letting him get into round 3. And it's just like the floor on Barkley, assuming he stays healthy this year, to me looks like a guy who gets 270 plus carries, should catch 50 plus passes. And then the ceiling on him is that he's something close to what Saquon Barkley was over the first year and a quarter of the second year of his career for a team that should be at least better on offense, even if it doesn't put everything together and blow people away. So I think the ceiling is very attractive, and the price that you're paying for Saquon Barkley right now makes it even more attractive.
Okay. So you've been drafting him where, like mid-second?
I started taking him in the mid-second and then realized I didn't have to. And like when you're drafting for volume right now, some of like spreading out player exposure just comes naturally by where you draft. So if I'm in the middle of round 1, I don't need to take Saquon Barkley in the middle of round 2 because I don't want him on every team. Right. So, if I'm picking 3rd, then I take somebody in round 1. I might take Barkley there, or I might wait and take him in round 3 when he gets there, which is happening way more than it should. Barkley, to me, I feel like people are going to be kicking themselves by the fall for letting him get into round 3 in their drafts when they look back.
Yeah, if he's healthy, I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, my kind of baseline projection on Barkley has him as a first round value. The floor I think is lower than other first rounders, but I also think it's the ceiling. I mean, behind McCaffrey and JT, like I think Barkley has as high a ceiling as any running back in football.
Yeah. Who's one that you're higher on than most, Jared?
James Conner sort of came out uncomfortably high in our rankings right now, but I'm kind of on board. Arizona obviously let Chase Edmonds walk. He went to Miami. Gave James Conner a pretty hefty deal, like a deal that says like he's our lead back. And we didn't see it a ton last year, but I think there were 4 games where Conner was healthy and Chase Edmonds was out, and Conner was awesome. He was like a top 5 PPR back in those games. So if he's going to play anything close to that type of role, he's a guy you can still get in the 3rd or 4th round in drafts right now. So I'm definitely scooping him up at that price.
Yeah, I mean, he may be in my top, 10, and once my projections are done, which is crazy. I mean, I'm not going to take him in the 1st or 2nd round if I don't have to. But yeah, I agree with you. I think he's a great value. My only concern, I saw somebody mock Breece Hall to the Cardinals yesterday. I was like, that would kind of throw a wrench in things. I've got Connor in a few dynasty leagues that I would not be happy about that. But
yeah, I'd be surprised if that was your pick. Yeah, me too. I think I think it's probably going to be a day 3 back though. Someone who can maybe take on some of what Chase Edmonds did. I don't think they're not as high as on Eno Benjamin as a lot of dynasty owners have been. So I do think they're going to add something. But again, I think the contract they gave Connor kind of says at least for this year he's their guy.
Yeah. Anybody else that you guys think of that you're higher on than most?
Miles Sanders, I think, is going too late. He should be the number 1 back in Philly, and he's going low in RB3 range right now. So he's just an easy buy because even if he busts, he's not killing any rosters. And then a few receivers I have listed. Brandon Cooks, I know that Jared has down as well because nobody likes to rank Brandon Cooks well. And then if you're going through honest projections, it's impossible to have him anywhere near as low as he comes out in the rankings. So he's an easy buy. And then 2 others for me, more later round guys, are Curtis Samuel and Robbie Anderson. They're both just like going much later than what their healthy, reasonable outlooks are. I guess I can't say floor because Robbie Anderson showed me that he has a basement where I thought a floor was last year.
Right.
But I think if, both healthy, both should very easily way out produce what they did last year. And they're just, you don't have to pay much to get them right now.
Curtis Samuel showed you the floor too. I mean, the guy didn't get on the field, so unbelievable.
Yeah, I'm giving Samuel a mulligan for last season. I'm on board with him. Robbie, I think if Carolina takes Kenny Pickett at 6th overall, like I don't love Pickett, but I think he's an obvious immediate upgrade over Sam Darnold. So I'd be more interested in Robbie if they take Pickett.
See, even Jared won't admit that he likes Robbie Anderson, but if you look at our rankings right now, he's 55th, and his ADP is something like 75 at wide receiver.
There you go.
He's hard to like. I mean, I also worry Terrace Marshall is going to take over that number 2 role. I mean, he did nothing last year, but I think he's a talented guy.
That's the thing. You can draft both of them right now, though. Take Robbie Anderson, take Terrace Marshall. If one works out, great. If neither works out, you haven't really lost much.
It's true.
Yeah, man, I loved Marshall coming into the league, like I think a lot of people did, but it's kind of rare for a receiver to be as crappy as a rookie as Marshall just was, and then sort of end up hitting in the NFL. So he's not someone I'm really betting on. If we start to hear positive stuff this summer, I'll kind of come back around on him quickly. But for now, I'm kind of out on Marshall. I mean, Carolina might be a sneaky team to add a wide receiver in, at day 2 of this draft.
Yep. I agree with all that. Anybody else you had, Jared, on your list?
Actually, I got another Cardinal here, but DeAndre Hopkins is someone I'm higher on than consensus. His target share just dipped quite a bit last season, but Arizona has lost. Again, they lost Chase Edmonds, who saw a bunch of targets last season. Christian Kirk is off to Jacksonville. AJ Green is still not re-signed. I don't think he's going to be back. Now, Arizona is a team I think they're a team that could go wide receiver in the 1st round even. That would make sense to me. So then we'd probably adjust Hopkins down a bit. But I still think even if Arizona adds a 1st round receiver, Hopkins' target share is going to rebound to at least something closer to what it was in 2020 when he finished top 3 among receivers and targets that year.
I mean, he was also hurt most of the year, but when he was healthy, I mean, he still had a pretty high target share. I just don't think he was as effective because of the injury either. Yeah. But yeah, that's a good call. It's hard for me to like him. I can't bring myself to actually want to draft him, but I agree. He should get tons of targets. And I think if they draft a rookie, that actually helps him, because if there's no one on the other side, he's going to be doubled every single time, which I think is why everyone likes, more on the other side or in the slot, because he's going to see a lot of single and all that. So.
And even with all our learning and new stats, you can still get an edge in fantasy by taking whether you like a player or not out of your drafting and just saying like, value lines up here, I'm going to go ahead and take him.
He's getting targets, yeah. That's what it all comes down to. That's good. Anybody you're lower on the consensus that you think of?
Yeah, I'm going to start with the guy that I'm lowest on and haven't taken at all in draft season so far, and it's Deebo Samuel, which I guess I would kind of like to not be a zero share on him because he's a fun player, but his draft position is just completely out of line with what is likely to happen this season. Last year, he finished the season leading the NFL in yards per catch and having scored on 13.5% of his rushing attempts. I'm going to go ahead and bet that neither of those things happen. So he could have an excellent season and come nowhere close to what he did last year. And there are still other factors working against him. We got a brand new quarterback who, even if he's good, it's just new. We don't know what it's going to look like. And Trey Lance runs plenty, so it's not going to be a boost to passing volume. And if Deebo Samuel keeps getting all those carries, it's going to mean fewer targets. That's what it meant last year, where if you took all of the touchdowns out of his stat line for the season, he averaged 4 more PPR points per game week 1 through 8 than he did the rest of the way. And the rest of the way was when he became half running back, half wide receiver. And you might say, well, that's stupid. Why would you take out all the touchdowns? Well, the point is we don't know the rate at which he's going to score touchdowns, either catching the ball or running the ball. So if we just ignore that temporarily, obviously he'll score at some point. But if we ignore that, we're just looking at usage. And the usage was way better when he was just a receiver than when they started giving him carries too.
Yeah, and on top of that, you have the whole like injury factor. I mean, you're running the ball, he's way more likely to get hurt.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like, all of a sudden, it's impossible for Deebo to get hurt. But, like, 12 months ago, he was like the most injury-prone wide receiver in the NFL. And the truth is definitely somewhere in between. But it's like people are, totally not factoring in the injury history at all right now.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I think he's so easy to like because he scores so many touchdowns and he's so dynamic and he breaks all the tackles. But you're right. I mean, the usage as a receiver is way down when he does that. And I mean, I think it may be back up. Like you're saying, if Lance rushes more and Deebo gets fewer carries, I could see that happening. But then again, it goes back to, is Lance going to be an actual good thrower of the football? We don't know that yet. It's a good one.
I definitely expect Deebo to be something closer to like the first half of last season when it comes to his role this year. But even then, just the efficiency he had as far as yards per catch and the touchdown rate and all that stuff, it's just going to be really tough to repeat, especially with a new quarterback.
And it sure sounds like they still want to give him plenty of carries. So just overall, there are a lot more downside paths than there are, as far as I'm concerned, than there are paths to paying off at where you have to take him, which is at the 1-2 turn or just barely into round 2.
That's the thing. If it's a 4th round pick, that's different. But
sure. Yeah.
How about you, Jared?
J.K. Dobbins has been an easy avoid for me so far. I mean, first of all, we don't even know what the knee is going to be like. He should be ready for week 1 based on, when he suffered the injury. But even if he's healthy, you look at Greg Roman's history, their offensive coordinator, he just goes with committee backfield. He's not going to just feed one guy. And we saw that Dobbins rookie season. Gus Edwards should be back from his own knee injury. There's been talk that, they're interested in Melvin Gordon. I've heard them linked to some of these rookie running backs. I think, Dobbins is not going to be a workhorse on the ground, and he's not going to do a ton in the passing game. The Ravens don't target their running backs much in general anyways. And again, I think some of that's going to be split between Edwards and, whoever else they bring in. So I just don't think Dobbins is going to get the volume he needs to pay off his price tag right now.
That makes sense. I like him also, but I just can't. I agree.
Awesome player, but I mean, it's all about volume. I just think
he's a great example of when you start think of drafting, you're like, "Ooh, J.K. Dobbins is back this year. He's going to do some stuff," and then you do the numbers, and you're like, is he really going to carry 250 times? And is that even a big enough number to overcome what the receiving will be? So, it's just tough to love him.
Yeah, that's a great example of the projections importance, right?
I think Michael Carter is an example of what's tough about projecting. If I go project the Jets right now, it's difficult to give the touches to other people enough to knock Michael Carter down to where I really feel comfortable drafting him. But I don't feel comfortable giving him that, true lead back share of touches. He doesn't look to me like a guy that they would want to carry more than 200 times. He should be fine as a receiver, but I don't know what the rest of the backfield is going to look like for sure. So that's the challenge at this time of year, is trying to factor in what I think will probably be a rookie added to that backfield. When you really don't know, and you could be completely wrong. Maybe they don't draft anybody until day 3, and Michael Carter is going at a good spot right now. For me, I'm uncomfortable drafting him as an RB2 because, again, I think he's a smaller guy. I think they're going to bring somebody in probably like round 2, round 3. I think the Jets would be a great candidate for that kind of running back, and I think we look at more of a split than what Michael Carter's current draft position would indicate.
Yeah, Carter was so tough for me. Like I go back and look at it, and I can't believe he was a 4th round pick. Like I thought he was a better prospect coming out. And I think he even, outproduced a 4th round price tag last season. I think he had a pretty nice rookie year. So I don't know if he escapes the draft, without the Jets taking someone before, like round 5, I'll be in on Michael Carter. But I agree with Matt. I think, they'd be a good spot for someone like Brian Robinson, that kind of early down big back to sort of be a, 1-2 punch with Carter.
Yeah, and that'd be killer because you just have to assume if they take him, he's going to get those first and second down, and and Carter's not even really a receiving back. I mean, he's really good between the tackles, but he's small. I feel like he's a great example of a guy that could see his stock shoot down very easily, but probably his stock is not going to shoot up that much. Even if he even if they draft nobody. He's going in like the 4th round or even 3rd or 5th, somewhere in there. He's not going to go up to the 2nd. I don't see any chance that happens, right? So I really love the player. I'm glad I have him on a bunch of dynasty leagues, but it's risky right now. It's scary that they're going to, even Breece Hall's in play there. So 2nd round pick. So we'll see.
Yeah, and that's a good example of a way to think about a player. If you are drafting right now, if you're not drafting until July or August, it doesn't really matter. But Michael Carter is right around RB 23, 24. So, you might think it's scary to be totally out on him, but there are a lot of months left to draft. Right. And as you said, Kevin, I don't think he's going to jump way up the board. And frankly, if he does, I'll continue to not want him. So if he stays there and his situation gets clearer and he is the clear lead back heading into the season, then I'll go ahead and start taking him in that range.
Yeah, I will never forget a few years back. I had Trey Mason on a bunch of dynasty teams, and I started drafting early, and I was drafting him. I remember this one trade I made right before the draft. I gave up, I don't remember what I gave up, but I gave up a lot to get Trey Mason because I believed in this guy. And then Gurley, 4th overall or 10th overall? I think it's 10th, but it was like immediate, complete loss of value. And I was just heartbroken. Yeah, you just got to be careful right before the draft.
And Mason is a good comp for Carter because he was a 3rd round pick. Like, draft capital matters, and the Jets didn't invest a whole lot into Michael Carter. So it would not be surprised if they, took it back on day 2.
It'd be sad. I'd be sad, but I wouldn't be surprised either. Plus, it's the Jets. I mean, you just never know what the Jets are going to do, right?
Right.
Anybody else you guys wanted to mention before we move to the next thing, like you're lower on?
Last guy I had that I'm lower on, I'm not even like, where is Jalen Waddle going in drafts right now? Like, we still have his ADP in the 3rd round. I'm not sure if that's caught up.
He's in the 2nd most of the time.
Yeah, see that's way too high for me. I mean,
even
he had
with Tyreek,
I mean, he had a nice rookie year, but like he's not seeing 140 targets again with Tyreek Hill there. And I think Miami's probably going to pass a little less. At least I had them projected to pass quite a bit less with Mike McDaniel there. Coming from the Kyle Shanahan tree before they traded for Tyreek. Now I think you look at kind of the moves they've made. Tyreek Hill, Chase Edmonds, a pass catching back. They're probably going to pass more than I initially thought. But I still don't see enough targets for Waddle to pay off that price tag right now.
I would love to see where Waddle would go if we could just start with a blank ADP slate right now and just have people draft where they thought he should go. Because I have no idea what it would be. I think for me personally, if he got into round 4, I'd be like, okay, that's fine. If he's going in round 2, it's definitely not. And then like end of round 3 would be maybe a situation by situation thing.
Even like round 3, you sort of need him to at least come close to matching Tyreek Hill in targets, which I guess is possible. Again, Waddle, 1st round pick, had a nice rookie year, but I don't know. Tyreek Hill is just special, and they obviously paid a ton to get him, and then to sign him to the new deal. So I think it's going to be kind of Tyreek is at least the like 1A there, and Waddle is the 1B, kind of clearly behind Tyreek Hill in targets.
I agree. And the 1A, 1B thing transitions nicely into my final lower than player, and that's Cortland Sutton. And I've kind of just been against Cortland Sutton relative to market. It feels like throughout his career. I don't really remember at this point when it started, when we started having our issues. But if you look back to his college career, he was giving us signals that he's something short of special. And that doesn't mean he's not good, but he's not a special prospect. Like his final season at SMU, he fell behind Trey Quinn as a receiver who was a transfer new to the team, and Cortland Sutton was the established number one receiver. And all of a sudden, Trey Quinn, who was a slot receiver basically, overtook him in receptions and yards. Then Cortland Sutton as a 6'3", 218-pound guy with good college production, 85th percentile speed score, goes in the second round of that draft. Only 2 wideouts went in round 1, DJ Moore, Calvin Ridley. It was not an outstanding class in hindsight, looking back on it here. And just, like it wasn't an outstanding class at the time. They had 2 centers, 2 running backs, 3 safeties going round 1. So that's not the signal of a tremendous draft class. And then more recently, I know he was coming off an ACL tear, but Cortland Sutton just completely disappeared from a target standpoint when Jerry Jeudy came back. And we collectively like to say that players earn targets. Where were Cortland Sutton's earned targets last year when Jerry Jeudy was on the field? So everybody gets a jump when Russell Wilson's in town, but Cortland Sutton got that bump into the top 30, and that's just not where I'm at with him.
Yeah, even Tim Patrick was better than Sutton by a lot of metrics last season. So I don't know. Sutton's a tough one for me. I think I like him as a player a bit more than Matt does, but I definitely think Jerry Jeudy was the better prospect coming into the NFL. And I think Judy's the one I really want to bet on this season. I don't really want to be off Sutton because I do still think he's a good player, and he's not catching passes from Russell Wilson, which you always like. But Judy's definitely the Broncos receiver I'm excited about.
Interesting. Yeah, I've been thinking about it in terms of Jeudy in the slot, and that Wilson doesn't historically like the slot that much. He did go to lock it a lot out of the slot, I guess, and. But it seems like he likes throwing to the edges a little more. Even if a guy starts in the slot, he likes those post routes and stuff like that. But you never know. I like Jeudy as a prospect as well. I just feel like Sutton has a lot of potential to play that Metcalf role in that offense. I know it's a different offense, but with Russ, and he's a dominant physical player. He just hasn't really played that way, But yeah, I don't have a problem with that one. I think if I get him in the 6th round or so, I'm good with that, just because of the upside. But
I mean, Sutton had 1,100 yards in his second NFL season, and then he tore his ACL early in the 3rd, and then last year I don't know if he was never completely healthy. The quarterback situation was a mess, obviously, but it is a concern for me that Patrick was better than Sutton, kind of no matter how you look at it last season. I do think Patrick's a pretty good player, but you'd want Sutton to.
It was annoying.
Produce him. Yeah,
stop producing, Patrick. Let me go with Sutton here. How about rookies? Anybody you're higher or lower on than everybody? I guess right now we're just having mainly Twitter chat about these rookies. We don't really get to see it in action aside from where they slot in and these best balls. But anybody you're higher or lower on?
You got Jared.
I guess at running back, Rachaad White's kind of become my guy, and I'm really just hoping the NFL likes him at least close to as much as I do. Like I hope if he goes anywhere on day 2, I'll be in for dynasty, maybe even for redraft, depending on where he lands exactly. Jets would be nice, yeah. But I mean, I think to me, basically any metric I look at, White looks like the best pass catching running back in this class, which is obviously huge for fantasy. Like we know targets are worth more than carries. We want our backs catching passes. I think White's going to do that in the NFL. But then he's also 214 pounds. He ran a 4.48 40. Had just awesome measurables and had pretty nice rushing production at Arizona State the past 2 seasons. So I think there's potential for him to be someone who carries 200 times in the NFL and then gets 50 to 60 targets. So that's something I'm definitely excited about for fantasy.
Yeah, it's solid tape too. I wrote up Rachaad White in our Dynasty Prospect Scouting Report series that is free on DraftSharks.com right now. So I like White as well. My problem with the running back class is I'm not ready to take a stand on any of them because I've learned over the past few years that these guys could sort out in any way once we get to the NFL draft. Last year I was high on Kenneth Gainwell and he went in round 5. So it's like At this point, I'm gonna say there are these guys that I like. Okay, I'll spread around in best ball drafts, and then we'll see what the NFL says to either confirm or reject what I think of them, or who might be Elijah Mitchell, and the draft capital doesn't matter. It's just about opportunity.
Yeah, it's interesting that the draft capital matters so much. Like you would think it's a little more talent, and like you just mentioned Mitchell. I mean, that was clearly his talent beat out Sermon on some level, unless it's just that Shanahan just likes him personally or something. You never know with Shanahan. But I just feel like, yeah, it's so much related to that. Like you were just talking about Michael Carter, that he could just be pushed out. They draft a second round back, and it's wild to me that they wouldn't just look at like it's clean slate, like who's on the roster, who's the best player. I'm sure some coaches do, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, of course, Mitchell versus Trey Sermon is like a reminder that even when draft capital says one thing, we have to watch throughout to see what happens, because clearly they just had both of them working, and Kyle Shanahan was like, I like this guy better than that guy, so we're going to give him the ball. For me, wide receiver has been more of the place where I'm higher or lower on players. And one player that I've stayed higher on is Sky Moore. I expected him to start getting some Elijah Moore love, because it seemed for a time like everybody was starting to love him, and I thought he was going to start jumping up draft boards, but it hasn't happened yet. So I'm enjoying that. He is a winner on the college market share front. He is a testing winner. He seems like a winner on tape. Jared could speak to that more than I can, because he watches the receivers more than I do. And most importantly, as I mentioned, Sky Moore is still going late in best ball drafts. So it's been easy to go ahead and get some of him before we see where he lands.
Yeah, I like him. And there's even been some first round buzz on Moore now. I think worst case, he's going to be a second round pick, which is always good. That's going to help his chances of getting on the field early. I always worry a little bit about the receivers coming from the MAC, because it's like lower level and those games tend to be shootouts. But yeah, Moore definitely checks all the boxes. I like the tape. I'm not sure he's going to be like a number one receiver in the NFL, but I think he can be a really good number two, and definitely someone that can help fantasy teams.
Yep, I agree. I really like him. I think he shocked me with the testing. I thought he was going to test poorly because he looks kind of short and stocky, and I was like, he'll probably be slow. And he's like, whoa, yeah, that guy he's very athletic. So I like him also. Anybody you just don't like before we move on? No, rookies you hate?
I'm definitely gonna be well below consensus on Christian Watson. I think at this point he's just a big athletic dude, which makes him exciting to some extent, but I just think he's going to go higher than I'd take him in the NFL draft. He's going to go higher than I take him in dynasty drafts, because I think he just has a long way to go, and he's obviously coming from a lower level college football conference. So I just think he's a project, and is more likely than not to bust. If he hits, the ceiling's huge because of the athleticism, but I think he's probably going to be a bust.
Yeah, I comped him to Cordell Patterson. I think he's a ridiculous athlete. You look at his numbers, it's like, wow, how did he do that at 6'5"? Both the agility and the straight line speed, and the ups, like just a crazy athlete. But yeah, you're right, totally raw. So it's hard to know. Anybody you hate, Matt?
Yeah, let me throw out one more name I like, just because he's barely getting drafted, and it's Bo Melton, who is a winner on market shares and testing numbers as well. He worked as a returner at Rutgers and the Senior Bowl, and has not generated much buzz. So I think he's going to be like a true sleeper come rookie draft season. And he's one of those guys that's not getting drafted at all in best ball. So you take him like a couple times as your 10th receiver, and if something happens, then
what was his name?
Differentiator. Bo Melton from Rutgers.
Bo Melton. I have not even heard of him.
Awesome.
I haven't watched him yet. I know he did have some nice metrics that I noticed when I was kind of compiling those, but I have not watched him yet. So definitely
was it his pro day? Because he wasn't at the combine, I assume.
I believe he was at the combine.
Might have been.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh.
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'm pretty sure he tested there. I think he was a sub 4.5 guy at the combine.
Okay, cool.
So now back to the negative. Now that I pumped somebody up, my negative is Zamir White from Georgia, which I'm surprised that he is getting as much love as he is, because I just don't see what's special about his profile right now. And you might say, duh, it's the speed score, 95th percentile. He's big and he's fast, but that makes him a power back at 215 pounds, which is not huge. So he's not going to be AJ Dillon for some team. He displayed absolutely no receiving ability at Georgia. Like, not just a team didn't throw him the ball, but the team chose to throw to other running backs instead of him. And his college production didn't stand out in any particular area. He didn't control touch volume on the ground. Even he didn't beat his teammates in yards per carry. So I think he's just a limited prospect that people are boosting because he has speed and was an elite recruiting prospect heading into college.
And in an elite program, and he's in the national championship. Everybody saw him, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's tough for me to get excited about any of these running backs that I don't expect to do a whole lot in the passing game, because I just feel like I can kind of find those guys on the waiver wire almost.
I agree.
And I do think White is one of those guys who probably isn't going to do much in the passing game.
Speedy Jordan Howard.
Yeah. When I watch him, he just doesn't look like he has any agility, like no side to side. It's just always straight ahead into the next guy. If he hits a hole, he can take it to the house. But yeah, there's just not much else there. So I totally agree with you. And then again, we could be completely wrong, and he could surprise us depending on where he lands. That's the fun part. So yeah, thanks for going through that. So the last two questions I've asked every expert I've had on, just wanted to throw out to you guys. What's one thing you've learned in the past year, or maybe a way you've improved in your process or even in your skill as a player?
All right. So the one thing I'm really focusing on in drafts so far this year, and I'm going to continue into the summer, is I've had such a hard time getting away from the weight on a quarterback thing. So I just think the quarterback landscape has changed with these elite guys who can put up massive passing and rushing numbers. And I'm just uncomfortable taking them in, the 4th, 5th, 6th round. But I think we've seen studies done of, what's winning, and, getting those elite quarterbacks, even if you have to take them in round 5, has sort of been the way to go. So I'm really, I didn't have enough of those guys on my teams last year. So I'm really trying to force myself this year to sort of get away from what I'm comfortable with, and, spend a 5th round pick on Lamar Jackson if I need to.
100% with you. That described me completely. I'm trying to do it, but it's hard for me. And I was so used to 12th round quarterbacks. How about you, Matt?
That kind of folds into my thing, but mine is from a broader perspective. I've been paying more attention to, and at least trying to pay more attention to, biases and the way that they affect how I project, how I draft, and how the market works. How the draft is going and how people are projecting in general. I think that we all know that we're biased. It's impossible to completely put biases aside, but you can kind of look back or look down at what's going on and see where it might be affecting things more than it should. I pulled out 3 particular things in an article that I wrote last summer that was centered on Mike Davis, but it was really kind of a more general view. And there was overconfidence effect, which is basically overestimating our own knowledge and ability to predict. And especially when we're experts, we like to believe that we know so much about this and we are right about these things, even as we say that we know we're going to get stuff wrong. So I think it's important to keep in mind that we are going to get stuff wrong and think about what those things could be. Doesn't mean you doubt everything, but look for spots where maybe you are being overconfident. Recency bias, which I think we're all familiar with at this point, basically just weighing something that happened more recently heavier than you did everything that came before that. And then social proof, which I think ADP speaks to, and other things in that vein, but it's seeing others behave the same way that you are and how that confirms to you that you are correct. So basically, if you're drafting a guy at a certain level and then his ADP has him at that level, instead of thinking maybe we're all drafting this guy too high, it's, well, see, that's what the market says, so I'm right about this guy. So Deebo Samuel, I think, is some of that. He's just he started out the offseason there at the end of round 1, and then he's just stayed there because that's where ADP keeps him. So even if he slips, somebody's going to take him 15th, 16th because they're like, oh, I'm getting Deebo Samuel at a value, where if we all have Deebo collectively overvalued, then we're all still getting it wrong if he's getting taken anywhere in that range.
Deebo Samuel is an example of all those biases. He's definitely an example of recency bias, coming off the big season. We're sort of all forgetting that he was kind of disappointing and injury prone over his first few years. So he's a good example of all of those, I think.
Yeah, those are great. Good thoughts, guys. Last question for you, and then we'll jump into this exercise to finish out. If our listeners want to improve, maybe it's, just win their home league, maybe it's jump into a bunch more leagues or higher dollar contests, whatever it might be. What's one thing that you'd say a fantasy player really needs to work on? One thing that sets great players apart from the crowd a little bit?
To me, it's being open-minded heading into your draft and throughout your draft. Like I think zero running back can work. I think robust running back can work. I think, getting a quarterback early can work. Getting a quarterback late can work, even though I'm, trying to get one earlier in most of my drafts this year. I just think all that stuff can work if the draft presents the opportunity for it to work. Like you have to, again, I think that goes back to floor and ceiling projections, understanding that. I think understanding your tiers and like where runs are happening at different positions throughout your draft, and just, being able and willing to adjust on the fly and sort of change your strategy based on what the draft's giving you.
That's great.
Yeah, I'm going to cheat and give you 3 key things. The first one is basically that don't be too rigid in anything. Could be your opinions on specific players, or, never take a quarterback early. If you're too rigid on anything, it's going to come back and bite you. And then on the other hand, don't be too reactive. Don't get caught up in a run at a specific position and just take the next guy, when the better move would be taking the best guy at another position and disrupting that run. The other 2, chase upside just in general. And I think that's something that I've gotten from playing some DFS and more best ball is, you kind of weigh upside versus floor or safety as you're drafting, but really none of these guys is safe, because the safest player could tear his ACL the next day in practice. So you want to chase upside. And then really the key to ultimately winning, whether it's one league or a tournament, is getting those few guys that absolutely blow out their expectations, like explode versus their draft position. The only way to get those few guys is to take more upside chances, unless you just happen to get your 3 guesses right that season. Right. And then the third is just, it kind of wraps everything together. It's optimize your approach, play to your specific format, build your team properly, react accordingly. And, I think that's important. You want to say don't overreact, but sometimes overreacting is the way to react. Like, you could have told somebody that spending most of their free agent budget on Elijah Mitchell in week 1 last year was overreacting. Turns out it was a proper reaction, and you had to do that to get Elijah Mitchell. So right. I think it's, you kind of have to think about what is an appropriate reaction level, rather than say don't overreact, don't underreact.
Great thoughts. Yeah. Love it.
Yeah, the upside one is so good, and I think about it a lot. And sometimes it makes me a little sad, because like we spend all this time evaluating, like, I don't know, 400, 500 players across the NFL. And like the fantasy season usually comes down to like, did you draft these 2 or 3 guys? Yep. So I think that goes to chasing the upside.
Most years, not as much as last season, but yeah, last season was so Debo Cup kind of central.
Yeah.
A few of those guys that, yeah, very cool. Good thoughts, guys. And thank you for sharing those. We're going to finish with just ranking our tight ends. We've done most of the positions here. Tight ends we have not touched on yet. So I thought, you guys have already, like I said, done so many projections. This will be interesting to see. My projections, I have not finished yet. So my rankings are really based on gut feel, and the little bit I've done. So it'll be interesting to see how they stack up with yours. So let's just start with, the first 2 or 3, and then I'll compare with mine. Who you guys have at the top?
Yeah, so we have Kelsey at 1, sort of in a tier of his own, and that kind of changed after the Tyreek Hill trade. Kelsey was, kind of right there with these next 2 guys before the Hill trade, but I just think, he has to soak up some extra targets with Hill gone. So we kind of have Kelsey up at 1 by himself, and then kind of the next tier we have Mark Andrews 2 and Kyle Pitts at 3.
Okay, interesting. And my top 3 are Kelsey, Andrews, Waller. So I know Waller is probably going to fall a little bit when I do the full projections because of Devontae Adams being added. But I feel like at the same time, the tide rising, kind of all boats kind of thing could help him. So, and I have Pitts down at 5th. I just don't know what to make of him, man. I don't know with Mariota there. I don't know if he's going to ever, or if he will pop eventually, but if he's going to pop now, if you need somebody, more firepower on the outside, I mean, they could draft receivers, but tell us a little bit about why you have Pitts at 3rd.
Probably because he's going to get 187 targets this year, right, Jared?
That's your projection.
Honestly, it's volume, and just thinking everything we've seen says he's an elite player.
Yeah.
So if you give him an elite player, that type of volume. Now that could change if they take a receiver at 8 overall. We'll probably bring Pitts' target share down a little bit. It's funny you mentioned Waller too. He was our tight end 3 before the Adams trade, but Adams shaved like 2 or 3 percentage points of target share from Waller, and that
makes sense.
Dropped him down.
Yeah. So Pitts, you feel like even with a bad quarterback situation, just based on volume, he's going to get that much enough to finish that high.
I mean, part of why we might feel uncomfortable about Pitts too is that he only scored 1 touchdown last year, and that's just
true.
I mean, that's just not going to happen. Even if he scores 4, he quadrupled his total from last year. So it doesn't. You know, the QB situation probably hurts efficiency, but when he's kind of set up right now like Darren Waller was the past few years with the Raiders, where you don't really know how many targets to give him, but you know that he's
a lot.
Yeah, the ceiling is pretty high.
Right.
I'm also not sure how big a downgrade Mariota is going to be from Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan's had a nice career, but he's obviously on the decline at this point.
Yeah, there's definitely potential truth there. I mean, I think at least Ryan is a legit NFL player, and he's accurate and that kind of thing. And I question that with Mariota. But coming out, I like Mariota. I mean, I think he's got a lot of tools, so it'll be interesting. Who do you have at 4 and 5 and 6?
Yeah, so we kind of have 2 guys in our next tier. The first one is Waller, and at 5 we have Dallas Goedert at 5 right now.
Oh, okay. I know is, wow,
a few spots higher than ADP.
So why do you have Goddard that high? I mean, when you look at the projections, do you think that the Eagles are going to pass more than they did last year?
Yeah, they almost have. They had such a funny season. I think it was the first 6 weeks, right? They were super pass heavy, and then they went completely opposite. And they were pretty easily the run heaviest team from week 7 on or whatever it was. So I do think they probably settle somewhere in between this season. But then really with Goddard, I mean, it's Zach Ertz is gone. I feel like we've all been waiting, 3 years or whatever for Goddard to kind of have the position to himself, and he finally has it. I was just looking through some of last year's data, and Goddard led tight ends in yards per route run last season, which is pretty predictive stat as far as projecting out to the future. So I still think he's an elite talent.
He just didn't run that many routes, apparently, right?
Yeah, that was definitely, and I think that's going to climb this year if they throw more, and he's going to soak up a bunch of those targets.
If you look at Nick Sirianni, it looks like he hasn't slept in about 3 years. So I think he's just a little bit slow to catch up on what he should be doing. And I mean, if you look at what they did last year, like Jared said, going pass heavy at the beginning of the year, it was like, what are you guys doing? And then it was like he figured it out, but then he figured it out too much, and they passed 42% of the time the rest of the way, and that's even peak Lamar Jackson Ravens weren't going quite that heavy. So now if Nick Sirianni got a little bit of sleep over the offseason, I'm not sure he did based on what I've seen in interviews, but he should figure it out a little bit more. They'll throw the ball a little bit more. And that's one key with Dallas Goedert is there are kind of multiple paths here. Maybe they throw the ball a lot more and there are just a bunch more targets available and he gets his normal slice and it comes that way. Maybe he's efficient on touchdown. Maybe he just stays efficient the way that he was before, and he benefits from playing at this position where you don't have to get a ton of targets. So I think Goddard looks like a nice floor play here with ceiling potential.
Yeah, as a Devonta Smith, a large shareholder last season, it was killing me how much they were running the ball. And then how on earth Miles Sanders did not score a rushing touchdown, I have no idea. But he managed. So that was the weirdest offensive season when you look back at it. So I had Kittle at 4, and I know that's high. And again, that's probably going to fall when I do projections with Lance, but love the talent. And then I had Pitts at 5. Who do you have from 6 on there?
And let me say, too, that I haven't gone all the way through my projections yet. So Kittle might rise up our rankings once I actually have numbers to start arguing with Jared about. I think we're a little bit low on Kittle, but really, Waller, Goddard, Kittle, I'm not –
they're like in a tier.
I don't care a whole lot what order they're in.
Right.
And we have Kittle at 6, although he is kind of in a different tier than Waller and Goddard. He's pretty clearly behind those two.
It's understandable. Yeah.
I mean, Kittle, his target share has shrunk in 3 straight seasons now. It was down to 21.5 last year, which is still, it's a nice number for a tight end, but it's not elite. And it's also 21.5 and, a run heavier offense that I think is going to shift even more towards the run this season with Trey Lance under center. And I don't think the target share is going to come up significantly as long as Debo and Brandon Ayuk are healthy. So I guess it's mostly a volume concern for me with Kittle.
So you have Kittle 6, and then where does he go from there?
Yes, we have Kittle 6, and then in the tier with Kittle, we have Dalton Schultz at 7. We have Rob Gronkowski 8 right now. We're projecting him back with Tampa. So that's where his numbers are coming from. And then we have TJ Hawkinson at 9 in that same tier.
Okay. Yeah, pretty close. I have 6. I have Schultz as well at 6, and then I have Hawkinson at 7. And then I actually have Freiermuth at 8. I know I'm higher than consensus there, especially with Trubisky. I just liked what I saw last season. So, yeah.
And it was a great.
It's a funny area tight end too, where
yeah,
a couple of touchdowns could be the difference between finishing 6th and finishing 14th.
Yeah, and I think right here is where I'd have Gronk as well. I didn't rank him, but that's about the range I'd have him. So it makes sense. So that was your 8th. You've been through 8, is that right?
Hawkinson was 9 in that tier.
Okay, 9. All right. So who do you have from 10 down?
Yeah, 10 through 15, they're all in the same tier. It's Zach Ertz at 10, 11's Mike Gesicki, 12 Hunter Henry, 13 Evan Ingram, 14's Pat Freiermuth, and 15's Cole Kmet.
Okay, very similar. I have 9 Ertz, 10 is Mike Goddard, so he's lower than you for sure, and that was just based on the pass run volume thing. 11, I have guy you didn't have in your list, and that's Albert O. I think he has a lot of potential with Denver to be their main guy there. And then I have Knox, Kmet, Gesicki, and Henry, so very similar to yours. I guess just missed out for me was Higbee, Logan Thomas, Gronk, because I didn't rank him, and Fant. Anybody that would be like right after this list for you?
Yeah, for me it's Albert O and David Njoku.
Okay,
2 guys I'd want to sneak into my top 15. They just
couldn't quite get
based
there
on my projections. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, well, that's good to know that I'm after you've done projections, I'm not that far off with my gut feel. Hopefully the projections will match up, or maybe they won't. Maybe that would be good to kind of change course on some of these guys. So yeah, well, that's awesome. Thank you so much for going through that and for coming on. It's really cool to meet you guys, and it's been fun hanging out for an hour. And before we sign off here, why don't you tell the folks where they can find you, how they can maybe help pay your salaries, and subscribe to Draft Sharks, whatever you want to share. Go for it.
Go ahead, Matt.
You could find us both at draftsharks.com, do all our stuff there. I'm on Twitter at SchaufDS. You got the Draft Sharks Fantasy YouTube channel. You can find our podcast, which is usually me and Jared, on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, a bunch of other places. So yeah, I mean, we are just like a small staff that's always focused on fantasy football. So whatever you pay for a subscription is just helping make sure that my kids get dinner that night.
Love it. And it's draftsharks.com. Yep. And then what was I going to ask you about that? Go ahead. You tell us, Jared. I'll think of it.
Yeah, I'm Matt Smola DS on Twitter. And then, so we have, again, our full projections up on Draft Sharks along with the Draft War Room. So you can get customized rankings for your specific league, based on our projections. So if you're doing these early drafts, I think it's a huge edge to have the projections, to have the Draft War Room, and those will be updated within 5 days after the NFL draft. We'll have those completely updated with all the rookies projected and all the changes. And then, we have all the dynasty content up now too. Our rookie profiles. We'll have our pre-draft rookie rankings coming in a couple weeks, and then our post-draft rankings will be right after the NFL draft. And then we'll have the full set of dynasty rankings updated shortly after the draft.
And it is okay to draft George Kittle earlier than Jared wants you to. Just so you know.
I mean, if you want to lose, yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Your podcast is called what? Just Draft Sharks?
Draft Sharks Fantasy Football Podcast.
All right. I'll be checking that out, and because it's been good talking to you guys, I'll definitely give it a listen. And so yeah, if you're listening to us now, please make sure to follow these guys on Twitter, follow their podcast. And I don't know what it costs, but go ahead and subscribe, whatever it costs, because these guys have kids that need to eat, and that's important. So thanks for coming on, guys. For Jared Smola and Matt Schauf, I'm Kevin Scott. We'll see you next time.